On Easter morning in 1847, the plantation lay gripped by a peculiar stillness, a silence more profound than the simple absence of sound. It was a silence heavy with unseen burdens. Amid the flickering lamp oil and the faint tang of smoldering ash from the hearths, enslaved bodies moved with careful restraint, their movements taut with expectation. This day was marked by the church feast, a ritual woven into the plantation's calendar, yet beneath its surface stirred an intangible tension, like the quiet before a storm's first crack of thunder. Could celebration truly mask a soul's quiet desperation? The morning air bore the subtle scent of damp earth and wilted honeysuckle, permeating the slave quarters with seasonal melancholy. As the cooks prepared the food, cornbread, stewed greens, and cured pork, the enslaved whispered prayers and exchanged furtive glances. The cloths they wore, coarse and darkened by wear, caught the pale light seeping through cracks in the cabins, a constant reminder of the distinctions drawn sharply between master and servant. Each folded hem, each rough stitch, imposed an external order, mirroring the tighter one, the master's law clenched around their lives. The very rope, used to tether tools and tether bodies, seemed to tighten invisibly in the air, an unyielding measure of control. What silently awaited beneath the hymns and prayers? The procession toward the whitewashed church was careful and segmented. The enslaved folded into the back pews, their space marked as much by absence as by presence. The feathers from a rooster dragged softly against wooden planks, brushing the floorboards with the sound of a whispered threat. The slave codes, rigid edicts, born from fear, hung over the day like a dark cloud. No slave could leave the property without written pass or white supervision. A slip, a single misstep, could bring brutal chastisement, whipping, mutilation. Worse, yet, the dread was not solely from external law, but from a deeper understanding that this feast was a fragile truce, a performance. Would Rebecca's silence at this feast break? And if so, how violently? Within the church's sacred walls, light was filtered through colored glass, casting fractured mosaics upon the dusty floor. The heat of the pressed crowd mingled with the acrid smell of sweat and lamp oil, pressing in on every breathing space. Among the planted rows of pews sat Rebecca, her gaze fixed not on the sermon or the hymn sheets, but on the glint of a modest blade concealed beneath the folds of her apron. The cold, hard edge, a stark contrast to the softness of worn cloth against her skin. Her breath was steady but shallow, hands clenched briefly into fists, nails biting the roughness of worn leather. The atmosphere was electric, with unsaid words and unspent fury. How long could a body hold such silent rebellion? As the feast began with the cutting of the meat and the blessing over the bread, voices rose in a fragile chorus that could crumble at any moment. The rustle of cloth, the clink of pews, all layered beneath a heartbeat thick with waiting, as if the air itself strained to hear what must not be spoken. The rope motif, so often the slave's literal and figurative bind, appeared in the twisted knots of the scattered twine on the feast table, in the lash marks hidden beneath folds of skirt, in the tightening coil of tension ready to unravel. What unseen thread would snap first, and what shape would its break take? The silence, thick and oppressive since dawn, now cloaked every whispered hope and every secret grief. It was a silence pregnant with a dark inevitability, its weight settling like frost grit underfoot, cold, unyielding, and inescapable. The slaves bore it as they bore their fetters, seen but unfelt by the masters, but palpably crushing to the soul. What lay beneath the surface of this Easter, so sanctified by prayer and tradition, was a conflict writ in the harsh geometry of control and defiance, a moment poised on the knife edge between subjugation and a desperate, searing flicker of freedom. The feast hall's shadows lengthened, drawing a curtain over a day that would neither pass quietly nor be easily forgotten. The rope was taut, the silence was waiting. The slave codes of South Carolina, in the 1840s, wove a relentless tapestry of control and dread, their provisions as unyielding as iron shackles, yet as precise as threads in fine cloth. Punishments were severe and often brutal, designed to instill fear and suppress any spark of resistance before it could ignite. Brandings marked flesh, the letter R scorched onto a slave's cheek to denote runaway and warn others of the fate awaiting defiance. Eyes reflected the horror of mutilations, nose slittings, ear cropping, emasculation, each atrocity wielded as a tool of absolute power. The law permitted whipping as a frequent occurrence, often administered publicly to reinforce the planter class's dominance over bodies and spirits alike. Yet, even more chilling was the double standard embedded in these codes. A white person who killed a slave was rarely punished harshly, the courts treating such acts as misdemeanors or imposing small fines. This legal imbalance normalized violence and justified cruelty as a necessary method of control, a constant menace stalking the enslaved from dawn to dusk. Movement was tightly restricted. No slave could leave plantation grounds without written permission, a pass as essential and fragile as a thread in a storm. The absence of such a document meant immediate danger, sometimes death. Homes and huts were not sanctuaries, but sites for invasive searches by slave patrols seeking weapons or contraband, the only mercy being the rarity of true leniency. A slave caught gathering in groups, or even playing drums and horns, could be accused of inciting rebellion. The prohibition of literacy and communication underscored the dread of organized resistance. The most basic human tool of knowledge and connection was outlawed. How could souls remain unbroken under such ceaseless degradation? The codes wrapped around daily life like a suffocating cloak. Clothing was regulated, no fabrics finer than coarse Negro cloth, to ensure visual hierarchy was maintained. The law forbade slaves from hiring themselves out, owning property, or engaging in even basic commerce. Autonomy was a crime as much as escape. The threat of emasculation, the horror of branding, the public spectacle of whipping were not punishments alone, but performances designed to recreate the master's dominion with each inflicted wound. Within this framework, every breath a slave took was a silent act of endurance and rebellion. These laws were both shield and sword for the planter elite, shielding them from fear of insurrection, swording away any hope of freedom. Yet such harsh law was not absolute in daily practice. The ledger leaves gaps where slaves exercised quiet negotiation or deflated tensions in moments unseen. Still, the specter of these punishments cast long shadows over every interaction, infusing every festival, every feast, and every day's labor with a shadow of dread and the constant sharpening of unease. In such a world, Rebecca's act of violence was not merely a collision with her oppressor, but a gut reaction to a society that wielded law as weapon and silence as prison. The rope, the symbol and tool of captivity, also became a turning point, both literal and metaphorical, binding and unraveling fates within its tight coil. Would an act of blood carve a path from bondage to freedom, or tighten the noose forever? The church feast was meant to be an act of ritual submission, a moment wherein the bonds of enslavement were momentarily concealed beneath the veneer of faith and shared feast. Yet for Rebecca, the dawn of Easter morning in 1847 was a crucible of smoldering rage and silent reckoning. Her hands trembled, not from cold, but from the weight of countless sins endured in shadowed quarters, whippings etched deep into flesh, family ripped apart by trade, names erased beneath the planter's ledger. The rough sway of her coarse skirt brushed against the hard wooden floor as she entered the church, each step a measure of her resolve. Behind her quiet face lay a tempest, a fury coiled tightly like the rope that tethered many a broken body outside the church's purview. Records imply that such feasts were both an expression of control and a brittle facade, the prayers and hymns failing to mask the undercurrents of fear and resented servitude. The heavy scent of beeswax and smoke filled the air, mingling with the bitterness of sweat and grief. Rebecca's eyes, sharp beneath lowered lids, surveyed the room and the faces, some fearful, some resigned, others watchful. The dividing line in the pews was plain, white planters up front, enslaved folk relegated behind, hemmed in by unspoken laws and physical barriers. The sharp edge of a knife, concealed beneath the folds of her apron, pressed cold against her palm, a silent witness to her breaking point. What secret agony had driven her to clutch such a blade in a place consecrated to peace? The feast, began with ritual precision. The blessing of loaves and meats, speeches extolling obedience and piety, but the buttery softness of the cornbread and the savory aroma of the greens could not sweeten bitterness built over lifetimes. The sounds of cutlery on wooden plates echoed hollowly, like a heartbeat under threat. The rustling of cloth and whispered prayers drowned beneath an ominous silence, thick as wool. What did the masters fail to hear in their sanctimonious words? The tightening of a throat unseen, the sharp inhale before a strike, the gathering storm beneath the calm surface. Rebecca's small, deliberate gesture shattered the fragile peace. The sharp, sudden slicing thud of metal on flesh echoed through the sanctified hall. The master's throat bled crimson, staining white linen, extinguishing prayers mid-passage. The weight of the moment bent time, folding it like leather, a breaking and unspooling of tension into raw, irreversible consequence. The rope that symbolized captivity twisted now into lifeblood and rebellion, binding fate and fury in an unyielding knot. What would come from this rupture? Liberation or ruin? The silence screamed in the space left behind. Every crack of the slaveholder's whip left echoes far beyond flesh. South Carolina's slave codes of the 1840s codified such cruelty with merciless precision. Brandings, mutilations, and death sanctioned under sham law. The rope, both literal and symbolic, bound bodies to unrelenting punishment. To escape was to court annihilation. Runaways faced death or systematic disfigurement, nose slitting, ear cropping, castration, each act etched permanently not only into flesh, but into the psyche of the enslaved. This legal architecture wielded violence as language and fear as law. Whippings were not mere punishments, but performances of power, repeated publicly. The lash tore rhythms into skin, while the master's eyes gauged compliance. Yet these laws deeply contradicted themselves. A white man who killed a slave could often escape harsh penalty, a judge issuing only fines. This brutal disparity declared the lives of the enslaved as property, not people, creating a fractured justice system where violence against the enslaved was normalized and legal boundaries mutable. Movement was tightly controlled, every journey without a pass, a dangerous gamble. Police patrols wielded the authority to seize and punish any slave on the streets or between plantations. Homes were not sanctuaries, but inspected regularly for weapons or illicit gatherings, as any togetherness could spiral into rebellion. Such laws also forbade literacy. Educative acts were criminalized, with death penalties for the circulation of incendiary literature. The slave master's world was guarded by silence and ignorance, each act of learning a brick removed from that fortress. Clothing, too, was regulated as a signifier of status, restricting slaves to coarse Negro cloth to maintain visible hierarchy. The code stripped any semblance of autonomy. No hiring out time, owning animals, boats, or tools, nor engaging in commerce. The slave's body was a canvas for control as much as labor. Each penalty, whether branding, whipping, or mutilation, was a statement of unyielding dominion. And yet, the ledger leaves gaps where slaves negotiated daily reprieves or subtle assertions of humanity, defying total control. This iron grip of law formed the crucible in which Rebecca lived and acted. Within such a system, a single act of violence was freighted with impossible consequences. The rope, the blade, the silence, symbols and tools of compulsion and revolt, wound tight around her fate. What seeming fragment of justice could break this cycle? The answer lay in the shadowed spaces between law and life, control and freedom, silence and cry. The eruption of violence at the church feast did not unfold in isolation, but unleashed a swift, merciless reckoning tightly bound to South Carolina's rigid slave codes. Once Rebecca's blade found its mark, the plantation's fragile order shattered, and the gears of law and punishment clicked into relentless motion. Records imply that such acts of violence were met, not with mercy, but with immediate, often brutal retribution sanctioned by a legal system designed to reinforce absolute power. The codes mandated that enslaved persons accused of rebellion or violence faced the harshest penalties imaginable, Death for insurrection or injury to a white person was explicit. Yet these laws also outlined escalating punishments leading to execution, first whipping, then branding with an R for runaway across the cheek, followed by ear cropping, and ultimately castration for repeat offenses. This cascade of mutilations functioned both as punishment and gruesome warning to others, as visible markers of defiance deeply costed. The legal apparatus extended beyond the plantation. With white constables empowered to arrest and punish, the law itself elevated the overseers and patrols as agents of terror, ensuring that fear permeated every movement outside strict master control. Homes were likely searched in coming days for any weapons or illicit materials, with punishments intensifying for any found in violation. Even the whispers of rebellion could trigger brutal crackdowns, with gatherings deemed threatening and proscribed. Medical testimony and coroner's reports, though scarce and often filtered through racial bias, were deployed to affirm the legality of punishments inflicted. The law reduced white violence against slaves to mere misdemeanors, while slave resistance, even in defense of life, was criminalized with maximum severity. This paradox underscored the dehumanizing imbalance that justified extreme violence in the name of order. In this grim theater, the rope motif threaded through both the physical punishment and the tightening grip of the law. It symbolized the enslaved body as a site of conflict between brutal discipline and desperate resistance. Rebecca's act, thus, was not only a rupture, but a beacon of defiance carved into a system built to erase such acts from history. What stories would survive the tightening noose of silence and repression? The aftermath of Rebecca's violent act unfolded within a grim legal framework crafted to extinguish any flicker of rebellion. The South Carolina slave codes mandated swift and savage justice for slaves who dared to challenge white authority, especially through violence. The law allowed, and indeed enforced, a brutal hierarchy where the enslaved were defined as chattel, property stripped of any rights or protections. Following the incident, the plantation's constables and white overseers would have moved quickly, seizing Rebecca with little need for due process. Punishments for such an act, wounding or killing a master, were codified and severe. The first response was often public whipping, designed not only to punish the individual, but to terrorize the community into submission. If the punishment failed to suppress defiance, it escalated. Branding was common, the letter R scorched into the skin to mark rebellion, followed by mutilations such as ear cropping or nose slitting for repeated offenses. These physical punishments left victims permanently marked, a walking record of their transgressions visible to all. The ultimate penalty for a violent slave offense was death, commonly by hanging, applied not as justice, but as theatrical deterrence. It served as a stark warning etched in flames for those who might contemplate resistance. Medical reports and coroners' inquests, when they existed, were tools of the state, used to dehumanize and justify punishment rather than to seek truth or fairness. Such hearings were biased heavily in favor of white testimony. Notably, the law paradoxically permitted a slave to strike a white person only if defending the master's life, but never for self-defense, underscoring the absolute vulnerability imposed by the codes. Movement restrictions surrounding the case would have been strict. Slaves without a written pass or escort were targets for arrest, and the community would have been under heightened surveillance. Slave patrols, patrol wagons, and overseer searches would penetrate deeply into everyday life, intensifying general fear and repression. The plantation itself could face punitive legal measures if it failed to control its slaves according to code. In this ruthless system, Rebecca's act became a perilous rupture in the fabric of control. Her fate was bound not only by the physical rope used to restrain bodies, but by the intangible, suffocating legal cords that sought to erase her defiance from history. What remained for those who bore the marks, both visible and invisible, of oppression? The answer lived in the spaces between law and spirit, between silence and legend. The days following Rebecca's act at the Easter feast unfolded under the weight of an unforgiving justice system. South Carolina's slave codes, rigid and merciless, allowed little ambiguity in responding to violence by an enslaved person against a white master. The law was clear. Any slave who struck or wounded a white person faced immediate and severe punishment, intended to send a message of total control and prevent any hint of revolt. The first punishment was often a public whipping, brutal, calculated to humiliate and break the spirit, but the law provided a progression of harsher penalties if defiance persisted. Branding was common, the letter for runaway scorched onto the slave's face, a mark both painful and permanent. For subsequent transgressions, mutilations awaited, cutting off an ear or slitting the nose, all meant to mark the body as a repository of disobedience and shame. The ultimate penalty for such rebellion, and likely Rebekah's fate, was death, frequently by hanging, carried out in full public view as both punishment and warning. Witness testimony, coerced or biased, often sealed trials, while medical examinations reduced slaves to objects of law rather than human beings. In legal paradox, a slave could strike a white person only to defend the master's life, but never to defend themselves. This cruel double standard underscored the dehumanizing machinery of control. The tightly scripted legal process aimed to erase any rebellious spark through terror and spectacle. The enforcement rippled beyond the courtroom. Slave patrols scoured plantations and towns to detain suspected fugitives or conspirators. Homes were searched routinely for weapons or signs of uprising, amplifying fear and crushing community bonds. Even small gatherings were forbidden, as the law feared coordinated resistance more than isolated acts. The rope, a physical tool for restraint and symbolic marker of control, bound bodies and lives tightly. Through this brutal system, Rebekah's story risked vanishing into silence or becoming a whispered legend. The legal codes, while visible on paper and in courtrooms, could not fully capture the lived realities of those who resisted and survived. Her fatal act was a rupture in enforced silence, a desperate assertion of agency amid suffocating oppression. Would history remember or erase her cry, her wound, her name? This question lingered in the shadows cast by law and memory. The plantation itself stood suspended in an eerie stillness after the eruption of violence. An unsettling calm stretched thin like linen over bare bones. Yet under this mute surface, fractures ran deep. The master's family recoiled in horror, grappling with shock and an unspoken dread that haunted their halls like a cold draft. The feast, once a symbol of power and control, had become an unholy altar bearing fresh stains of blood and rebellion. Whispered fears passed from lips shuttered by protocol and prejudice. The overseer's rigid gaze darted between the broken plates and tense faces, the crack of a snapped chair leg unsettling the brittle veneer of order. Outside, an uneasy birdsong interrupted the heavy silence, mocking in its innocence as if nature bore witness to a secret it could never solve. What weight does guilt carry when cloaked in the silence of complicity? The master's legacy, built on chains and coerced submission, trembled precariously. Wealth measured in acres and flesh could not contain the volatile humanity breaking through its surface. The sprawling plantation's whitewashed walls bore marks of a fragile dominion now cracked, as though the very rope that once tethered bodies was tightening around the attention of all who lived within it. Shadows shifted in corners where laughter once echoed. A shadow play of suspicion and fear danced in the candlelight. Would the plantation's heart survive this fracture, or would it unravel into chaos? Within these moments of suspended breath, the subtle shift of power was palpable, but still unnamed. The dichotomy of ownership and rebellion coexisted in agonizing tension, the invisible rope taut with unspoken threats and unfulfilled desires. The master's blood was not just a wound on one body, but a scar on the entire social order. In the midst of this, a lone question hung in the air: who truly owns the night when silence is broken? The aftermath of slave rebellions cast deep ripples through plantation society, shaking the rigid social order to its core. Each act of defiance threatened the carefully constructed dominion of land, labor, and law that defined plantation life. The plantation system functioned as a totalizing unit, binding together economy and society in a nexus of control. Enforced by constant surveillance and brutal repression, Resistance emerged as both fragmentary acts and collective movements. Any crack in the facade was met with swift and savage reprisal. Plantation owners feared rebellion as a threat not only to their wealth, but to the underpinnings of an empire built on forced labor. Following violent incidents, patrols and overseers intensified their watchfulness. Homes were searched, gatherings dissolved, and punishments escalated to terrorize all enslaved people into silence. The public spectacle of punishment served as a grim lesson intended to extinguish any further sparks of insubordination. Yet beneath this, a complex culture of resistance thrived in secret through coded messages, slowed labor, subtle sabotage, and the preservation of spiritual and communal traditions. These acts of resistance, though often hidden, constantly challenged the plantation regime. The rope symbolized not only physical captivity, but the psychological bind of enforced obedience. It tightened again after every act of rebellion, drawing a near imperceptible boundary between limited survival and open revolt. In this tense social choreography, every moment was a balance between fear and hope, suppression and agency. The plantation, for all its vast fields and imposing architecture, was also a crucible of layered conflict and resilience. As the social order struggled to reassert itself after events like Rebecca's, the question lingered: how did such stubborn flickers of defiance endure amid a system designed to erase them? The legacy of rebellion was not only found in brutal punishments, but in the whispered stories, clandestine meetings, and enduring spirit that simply refused to be silenced. The moral fracture within the plantation echoed far beyond the immediate violence. It cleaved open deeper questions about law, justice, and survival. In a world designed to deny both, the preacher's sermon, thick with biblical injunctions to obey masters as serving the Lord, clashed sharply with the doctor's clinical recounting of wounds and punishment, one espousing moral order, the other the cold calculus of pain and control. The overseer's silent gaze, heavy with unspoken complicity, contrasted the whispers of gossip that spread like unsettled wind among the enslaved quarters. Each voice wove a part of a fractured narrative, speaking truths layered with denial, fear, and reluctant admiration. Faith and violence danced uneasily in the half-light of the church, the flickering candle casting moving shadows that blurred the lines between right and wrong. Was obedience a divine mandate or a survival strategy masked by piety? Could the brutal act of rebellion be reconciled with the slave's need for dignity and justice? The light spilling unevenly across cracked pews symbolized this dance, a chiaroscuro of moral ambiguity that haunted every corner of the plantation. How did those trapped in this fractured space navigate their own conscience? Would you weigh the preacher's call for submission against the doctor's cold record of broken flesh and quiet rage? The gulf between them cracked the community, forcing each soul to choose between loyalty and rebellion, survival and sacrifice. The moral paradox was not confined to those enslaved. It unsettled all who lived under tyranny's watchful eye. The rope motif, taut and knotted, symbolized this knot of divided conscience, a tension between enforced silence and irrepressible impulse, between pain and hope, between law and justice. The weight of memory pressed heavily on those who lived long after Rebecca's act of rebellion. Descendants, historians, and the very soil of the plantation itself carried fractures and echoes that blurred between history and myth. The archive's silence on such stories was a silence filled with tension, moments erased, yet never fully forgotten. The material remnants of the plantation, the worn rope fibers, fractured crockery, and scorched feastware, stood as mute witnesses to a violent past, tangible threads that connected present to history. Oral histories carried by descendants breathed life into Rebecca's story, where official records failed, preserving shades of truth in gestures, songs, and whispered recollections. These stories wrestled with erasure, distortion, and the politics of remembrance, forcing a confrontation between documented fact and lived experience. The rope returned again as a symbol, now no longer only of bondage, but of resilience and continuity, knotted tightly in memory, even when frayed in record. The plantation, once a fortress of white power and domination, had physically crumbled, its faded walls overtaken by nature's slow reclamation. Yet the spiritual echoes of struggle and survival remained vivid. The scent of honeysuckle in the warm breeze and the cold rust of iron tools were markers of history's persistent beneath the surface, tangible reminders that stories of resistance survive even in silence. This tension between memory and archive, between erasure and remembrance, framed Rebecca's legacy. Despite attempts to suppress, her act persisted as a sharp knot in the fabric of history, a reminder that the past is never truly settled, its threads continually pulled and rewoven by those who dare to remember and retell. The story of Rebecca sits within a long and complex legacy of resistance that shaped the social fabric of the American South and beyond. Slave rebellions, from small acts of defiance to large-scale insurrections, challenged the brutal system of chattel slavery. Though often suppressed violently, these uprisings punctuated history with undeniable statements of human will and the relentless quest for freedom. Each act of resistance sent ripple effects through plantation society and the wider world. The immediate aftermath usually meant repressive laws and harsher controls, as fear drove legislatures to tighten restrictions on movement, assembly, and education for enslaved people. One example was South Carolina's Slave Code of 1740, a direct response to earlier revolts, which instituted severe limits on the lives of enslaved individuals for generations. These laws shaped the lived experiences of tens of thousands, constricting possibilities and enforcing silent obedience even as quiet acts of resistance continued. Yet, resistance was never extinguished. Beyond armed rebellion, slaves engaged in everyday forms of defiance, slowed labor, secret schooling, clandestine worship, and the preservation of African-derived cultural practices. These acts sustained communities and identities under constant threat. Stories of these resistances, both documented and oral, inspired abolitionist movements in the North and informed international debates on human rights and freedom. Remembering Rebecca's act today invites reflection on these broader struggles. It underscores how rebellion, whether loud or quiet, corporeal or spiritual, forms a carved thread in the tapestry of history, one that challenges narratives of power and victimhood. The legacy is also a call to confront ongoing injustices, revealing how resistance reverberates through time and continues to demand justice and recognition in the present. Rebecca's story, preserved in fragmented archives and fading memories, becomes a testament to the enduring spirit of those who resisted, not only surviving but reshaping history, one perilous act at a time. The final threads of Rebecca's story intertwine with the broader, ongoing struggle for justice, memory, and recognition. Her act of rebellion, framed by brutal systems of oppression and silenced by legal and archival erasures, continues to echo in contemporary conversations about reparations and the legacy of slavery. Modern historians and descendants alike grapple with fragmented archives and silenced oral histories, piecing together narratives that refuse to be forgotten. The delicate knot of the rope symbolizes this enduring tension, a binding of past and present, pain and hope, erasure and remembrance. The physical plantation remnants may crumble under the passage of time, but the intangible threads of resistance persist in cultural memory and social consciousness. Rebecca's story demands a reckoning not only with the violence of history, but also with the resilience and agency of those who lived it. In the quiet shadows of memory, one question remains: how do we honor those who rebelled against injustice when their voices were deliberately muted? The rope's final knot is a testament to the incomplete but unbroken connection between generations, a call to unravel silence and weave justice anew.